Chapter 122, Church Kid, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu stared down at the god in his lap, petrified. "Oh gods! Oh fuck! He kissed me and it killed him!" An instant later, he realized how silly that was. Of course Antony wasn't breathing. Still, he looked so small and battered and helpless as he sprawled over Hanyu's lap. What should I do? Gingerly, Hanyu lifted his master and settled him on his back at the head of the bed, head propped up on his pillows. Antony didn't stir. Did that mean he was still hurt? Had Hanyu made it worse? I keep getting him hurt, and it's going to go on happening if he doesn't intend to let me go. I asked. He refused. Until he changes his mind, there's nothing I can do about it. Hanyu didn't have the first idea what he was feeling, let alone what he should feel about all this. He kissed me. After all the hours Hanyu had spent daydreaming about that exact event, he'd imagined his master rolling over in bed to pepper gentle, feathery kisses all over his face. He'd imagined Antony pressing him against a wall, yanking his arms over his head. The exact mechanics of this fantasy had never been terribly clear. Perhaps there was a stool involved. And claiming his mouth with searing command. He'd imagined Antony tilting his chin up when he was bowing and crying to press their lips sweetly together. All these daydreams and 100 others had lulled him to sleep night after night ever since he first met the god. And now, there it was. His master had kissed him. His lips had brushed against Hanyu's so cautiously that it had almost felt like nothing more substantial than cold sea foam being tossed over his mouth. Before Hanyu had even realized what was happening, Antony had flopped into his lap like a corpse, leaving Hanyu to try to untangle everything that had just occurred. His mind kept snagging on the memory of his master's face. Antony had leaned in, eyes wide and almost frightened, but burning with a tender intensity Hanyu didn't know how to read. That was one of the worst things about all this chaos. It didn't feel like he knew how to read Antony's face anymore. What was he to make of that open, reverent softness in his master's gaze as he leaned towards him? That sort of expression couldn't be meant for a disobedient human slave. It couldn't be meant for Hanyu. No one ever looked at me like that before. If it didn't happen when I was genuinely trying my best, how could it happen after I failed in every possible way? The things Antony had written, the tenderness in his eyes, the kiss, none of it fit. The temple had kept dozens of books full of edifying stories about what became of offerings who disobeyed the priests or displeased the gods. None of those outcomes involved kissing. And yes, it was true that those books had not matched up terribly closely with Hanyu's own experience of the ship so far. For one thing, Felix and, strangely enough, Thaddeus had featured heavily in those stories, dispensing bloody retribution and extending mercy only to the truly pure of heart. It was hard to picture Thad cutting off anybody's feet or removing squares of skin the way he did in the stories. But even if the books had been exaggerated, the lesson at their heart had always been the same. Obedience and submission were the only way to happiness. Rebellion and selfishness led to destruction. That hadn't just been the lesson behind the morality tales. Everything in the temple had been designed on these principles. The priests had explained it to the boys over and over. Everyone had their place, and happiness could only be found in acceptance of that place. The priests ruled the offerings, the fathers ruled the rank-and-file priests, and the high priest answered only to the gods. It had been impressed upon the offerings that they also served as an example for the people outside the temple, whose obedience to the nobles and the king was to be modeled on the same principles. The few holy days of the year on which the attendants went into the city to attend the ceremonies, they needed to display their willing submission for all to see so that they could help ensure the proper running of society. It was secondary to their holy purpose of appeasing the gods, of course, but it was still another way in which they could be valuable to their people. I even failed at that, Hanyu thought dolefully, thinking back to Asao's burning sleeve all those years ago. But at least back then, things had made sense. He could count on being punished when he violated the natural order with his impulsiveness and excitability. Everything the priest did was designed to help the boys learn to suppress and eventually crush any such unseemly tendencies. No amount of self-will, however small and seemingly innocent, could be tolerated. Something as simple as distaste for a particular food could become an obstacle to submission if it interfered with an attendant's ability to willingly surrender the choice of what he ate to his master. That unwillingness could open the door to ever-increasing rebellions until the offending offering found himself dead or abandoned. That was one of the earliest lessons Hanyu could recall. A single bite of onion and his ass and knuckles would still burn with phantom pain. He must have been 5 or 6, and for some reason the prospect of eating the cooked onions had seemed worse than the beatings he got for his refusal. Which priest had it been who finally held him down and forced it in his mouth? He wasn't sure, but he remembered that after he vomited, Father Shu had been there, looking so disappointed in him as he dished up a new serving of onion. The hated translucent bites had appeared on his plate at every meal for months after that, until he learned to eat them quietly, and then for quite some time afterwards. Now more than ever, Hanyu could see that the priests had been right. The flesh was full of weaknesses and temptations, and it would try to divert an attendant from his one true purpose, to serve. Ever since he could remember, Hanyu had known that his mind and body were riddled with traps, endless stumbling blocks that could trip his feet at any moment and send him tumbling into devastation. With Antony, he had let himself forget. His master had asked him about his favorite activities and fussed when Hanyu missed food or sleep. He had treated Hanyu's mistakes as though they didn't matter, and before he'd even realized what he was doing, Hanyu had begun to treat them the same way. A lifetime's vigilance, undone in a few months of indulgence. The priests had been right. It took constant, harsh discipline to keep a wretched thing like Hanyu in his place. They tried to warn me and teach me how to be better. I didn't listen. But then, for one moment, Hanyu had been granted everything he could possibly have wanted. He'd wanted somebody to look at him with adoration, as though just the sight of him were enough to fill their eyes. He'd wanted Antony's kisses with a yearning that seemed to open a hole in his middle. And that was just the trouble. He'd paid endless lip service to the idea of serving however his master chose, but it hadn't been true. He'd wanted Antony's attention and kindness to continue, and he'd wanted even more than that. He'd dared to grasp after his god's love. And just as the priests had warned, that selfish desire had led him down a dark path. He'd been disobedient and gotten his master hurt, an outcome so horrible that none of the stories had even bothered warning against it. But now, in a bewildering twist, instead of a punishment, he'd been handed his heart's desires. What does it all mean? It doesn't make any sense. He shouldn't let himself worry about it too much. There was no way the god had really meant all that. In the best-case scenario, Antony was full of emotion and pent-up love that he could no longer lavish on Marcus, and he'd simply had a moment so overwhelming that it had made him stop caring where he expressed those feelings. In the worst-case scenario, Antony was delirious and didn't know what he was doing. Or perhaps there was a scenario even worse than that. Perhaps this was his punishment. Perhaps Antony had done it to taunt him, to mock his blasphemous desires. Antony wouldn't do that to me! The thought was immediate and powerful, but Hanyu knew better than to trust it. Yes, his master had been unbelievably kind and seemed unnaturally distressed by Hanyu's pain, But that was before Hanyu's latest fuck-ups. Even Lord Antony's patience had to have its limits, and it would hardly be surprising if Hanyu had stomped right over them. He wouldn't, the thought persisted, even stronger than before. He'd never be so cruel. Hanyu shouldn't underestimate his master. Why shouldn't an ancient god who disciplined hundreds of attendants be able to discern the exact punishment that would hurt Hanyu most? And having realized that, why wouldn't he use it? It would be no better than Hanyu deserved for his presumption and rebellion. But no matter how much sense this explanation made, Hanyu just couldn't make himself believe it. Maybe, in a moment of blind panic, he could believe that Antony would take his eye or tongue, but such fearful visions never lasted long once he'd had a moment to settle down. Whatever Antony and the other gods did in the stories, Hanyu couldn't help relying more on what his master had done to him. He soothed me, told me beautiful lies, protected me, held me. I never would have believed that he would hold me even once, but now he's done it so many times I've lost count. He doesn't like to hurt people. He doesn't like to hurt me. He wouldn't pretend to forgive me and care about me just to throw it in my face. Not a punishment, then. At least, not an intentional one. However, even if Antony had been blind with grief or pain, the results were the same as if he'd planned this discipline with the coolest head in the world. Hanyu had been reminded of his place in the most excruciating way possible. If he had been a good, obedient offering, he could have taken these gestures as a sign of his master's favor and rejoiced in them. He would have been able to relax, delighted that his submission to his god's authority had been found pleasing and rewarded, the way it always was in the stories. Instead, he was forced to think of all the reasons why he didn't deserve this, and it clearly wasn't truly meant for him. There was no scenario in which Antony's strange fit continued when he woke. There would be no second kiss. And I barely even realized he was kissing me while it happened. The only kiss I'll ever have from him, and I didn't even appreciate it. I wasted it, just like I've wasted every other chance and good thing I've ever been given. If the kiss and the bewildering messages hadn't been his punishment, Hanyu was sure to be facing a different one soon. Antony might not maim him, but he was surely in for a hard beating and a steep loss of privileges at the very least. Perhaps a solid caning on the soles of his feet to teach him to restrict his movements to where he was told, and a banishment from the above-deck exercises. Perhaps a whipping that would lay him up as many days as his master ended up being bedridden. Perhaps a loss of speaking privileges, or a diet restricted to water and onion for days on end. More likely it would be all of those things, and more besides. Hanyu would accept it all gratefully and try to learn his lesson, but no intentional punishments were likely to be as effective as this pain-addled slip-up on his master's part. No matter. He would need his rest if he was going to endure the coming days. Hanyu knew he should crawl out of the bed and leave his master to his slumbers, but he was too exhausted from fear and crying, too deeply heart-sore to muster that kind of willpower. Too miserable even to cry, he curled up a respectful distance from his god's corpse-like form and tumbled into an uneasy sleep. Well, he thought as he drifted off, no one can say the priests didn't try their best to make me good. It's not their fault I turned out like this.